A stone leaves Ajax's hands. It is one of those boulders Homer says two of the strongest men of his own day could not have lifted from the ground onto a wagon. It slams into Hector's chest. The greatest warrior in Troy goes down dazed, the wind driven out of him, vomiting blood, and his own companions drag him off the field. On the plain, there is one thing only: a great fighter making a great throw at exactly the right moment. Muscle and luck and timing. That is the only story any of them will ever have. Now go up the mountain. Zeus has sworn Hector victory for this single day, and while that oath holds, a throw like that should not be allowed to land. It lands because at that exact moment, Zeus is asleep on Mount Ida in Hera's arms. She seduced him to pull his eyes off the battlefield so that Poseidon could go on helping the Greeks. Hector can be struck only because the king of the gods is unconscious. One blow, two complete explanations, neither one a decoration on the other. From the opening of Book 11 to the sunset in Book 18, a full third of the Iliad, Homer tells the same battle twice at once. The men fighting it get one version. The audience alone is given both. The day begins in Book 11. Zeus sends the messenger goddess Iris down to Hector with an instruction, and it is oddly specific. Hold back from the fighting. Stay out of it until you see Agamemnon wounded. Once Agamemnon has been struck and has pulled out of the line, Zeus promises Hector will have the power to kill his enemies all the way to the Greek ships until the sun goes down. Not forever. Not until Troy is safe. For the space of a single day, the king of the gods hands one man victory. That day, dawning at the opening of Book 11, is the longest in the entire poem. It runs unbroken to line 240 of Book 18 across a full third of the Iliad, and it ends only when the sun finally sets. Inside it, Hector receives his aristeia, his scene of special valor, the stretch of the poem where he fights better and kills more effectively than he ever has before. Hector's aristeia occupies most of books 12 through 15, so this is both the longest day in the Iliad, and one of its most extended looks at a single hero at the height of his excellence. To see what makes this day extraordinary, you have to look at it from two places at once. The fighting can be read on two entirely separate levels. On the purely human level, it makes complete sense on its own, and that is the only level the characters in the epic ordinarily perceive. Just as the mortals see the gods from below and so experience them as numinous, awe-inspiring, and dangerous, they see the battle from inside it, from their own narrow patch of ground. They have no idea of the upper level of divine motivation lying above and behind and beyond everything they do. Only the audience is given the fuller view, where both sets of motives run together. Take the human level alone then. Read purely as men fighting men. Books 11 through 15 follow the ordinary give and take of battle, and they do it with striking realism. It reads like a convincing account of what a desperate day-long battle would actually be like. Acts of courage and acts of despair on both sides. The balance of power shifting again and again. Some great heroes wounded while others fight magnificently. Confusion everywhere and disorder. Book 11 is about one thing above all, and that is how vulnerable the Greeks are without Achilles. From the Greek point of view, it opens well. They are fighting beautifully. The action begins with a brief aristeia for Agamemnon himself. He moves through the standard stages, he arms, he fights valiantly, and then he withdraws, wounded. He is the first Greek warrior hurt in this whole section, struck in the arm, the point stabbed clean through the flesh beneath the elbow. While the blood is still flowing, he keeps fighting. It is when the blood dries that the pain takes him, and Homer reaches for the commander of the Greek army, for the pangs of a woman in childbirth. That is the comparison. That is the pain that drives the king out of his own battle. Agamemnon withdraws. Hector rallies his men and rushes into the fighting, killing Greeks in numbers. Watch what the Greeks see. They see that Hector has noticed the wound and seized his moment, a commander with a good eye taking the opening he was given. That reading is complete. Nothing is missing from it. The audience, though, knows that Zeus told Hector to wait for exactly this, that the wound in Agamemnon's arm was the signal he had been told to wait for. On the human level, no additional motivation is needed at all. Hector simply sees his opportunity and takes it. Both explanations are whole, and both are running at the same time. Diomedes and Odysseus fight bravely, and both are wounded in quick succession. Paris shoots Diomedes in the foot with an arrow, driving it through so hard that it pins him for a moment to the ground. Paris taunts him. Diomedes answers with a comment aimed straight at the weapon. The bow, he says, is a coward's tool. It lets a man do injury from a safe distance without ever standing in danger himself. If Paris had the nerve to fight sword to sword, face to face, the outcome would be very different indeed. And the wound, Diomedes adds, is a scratch. No worse than what a woman or a child could inflict. It is a magnificent speech. It is also painful enough that Diomedes, exactly like Agamemnon before him, limps out of the fighting. Odysseus is next, stabbed in the ribs with a spear. The bone turns the point aside so that it never reaches his vital organs, but he is badly disabled where he stands. Ajax the Greater and Menelaus come for him, Ajax holding off the Trojans with his own body, while Menelaus walks Odysseus out of the battle. By the end of Book 11, the arithmetic is brutal. Diomedes, wounded. Agamemnon, wounded. Odysseus, wounded. That leaves Ajax the Greater as the only truly outstanding Greek warrior still standing in the line, and he fights to hold the Trojans back from the ships almost by himself. The situation is desperate. The fighting has come within reach of the beached ships. If those ships burn, the Greeks are trapped between the enemy ranks and the sea with no means of escape. Book 12 belongs to the Trojans and to Hector's promised day of glory. At his urging, they go at the Greek defensive trench and the wall. The Greeks built that wall against exactly this danger, a formidable thing of stone reinforced with timbers, and in front of it, between the wall and the plain of Troy, they dug a deep ditch. Together, the two make a double defense. Any attacker must first go down into the ditch, and then face that much greater height to climb. The wall is very likely impossible to scale. So the Trojans' aim and the Greeks' great fear are the same, not to go over it, to break through it. The first breach is made by Poseidon, a son of Zeus, who will later be killed by Patroclus. He makes it immediately after speaking to his friend Glaucus about the nature of glory, Kleos. If the two of us were immortal and ageless, he says, we would have no need to fight at all, but we must die. So we should win as much glory as we can for ourselves, or else grant it to another man by dying at his hands. Then, with those words barely finished, Sarpedon storms the wall, gets his hands into it, and tears part of it away. More significant still, Hector smashes the gate itself. He lifts a great boulder, carries it to the gate, and shatters the door leaves with it. And Homer stops the action to tell us that two men, the strongest in their community, could not lift that stone from the ground onto a wagon in the present day. So much more feeble are modern men than the heroes of old. Hector lifts it easily. That idea keeps returning through the poem. The men who fought at Troy were not only braver and closer to the gods, they were physically larger and stronger than the men of Homer's own time. This sense of degeneration, of a falling off in human stock from the ancient days to the present, runs through both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it is especially pronounced in the Iliad. With the gate destroyed and the wall breached, nothing now stands between the Trojans and the Greek ships, but a mass of demoralized Greeks who have lost their foremost warriors, Agamemnon, Diomedes, Odysseus, Achilles, every one of them out of the action. And then, in Book 13, the Greeks begin to rally. Calchas, the prophet who reads omens for the Greeks, moves along the ranks, encouraging the warriors. It is shameful, he tells them, for young, strong men to shrink from a fight. Now with the Trojans bursting through the wall and pressing toward the ships, is precisely the moment to fight harder than they have ever fought. As often happens in battle, a speech from a figure of authority does its work. The men rally, the tide turns temporarily against the Trojans, who fall back to take counsel among themselves about how best to proceed. Hector does not fall back. He keeps fighting, working his way past the ruined gate toward the Greek ranks with Paris at his side, and as Book 13 closes, Hector and Ajax the Greater meet face to face and trade insults without yet doing one another any harm. They will meet again. Through Book 14, the Greeks go on gaining strength, and in a wonderfully realistic touch, Agamemnon does not know it. He and Diomedes and Odysseus are away from the fighting, leaning on their spears and talking, wounded but not so badly that they cannot walk. Homer generally avoids wounds serious enough to keep a warrior off his feet unless they are going to kill him, so these three can move about and converse. Cut off from the action, they assume the worst. Agamemnon begins to wonder whether all the Greeks, like Achilles, have turned against him and are refusing to fight for his cause. They are commanders who cannot see their own battle. Nestor comes to the three of them with news. The wall has been breached, the gate smashed. And at that, for the third time in the Iliad, Agamemnon proposes simply giving up and going home, that this very night, before the Trojans can burn the ships, the Greeks should launch and sail away. Odysseus and Diomedes are furious. Diomedes insists on the opposite, that the three of them, wounded as they are, should go back into the battle and encourage the other Greeks by being seen there. That is what happens. Rejoining the fighting, they arrange something curious. They redistribute the armor. The best equipment goes to the best fighters and the worst to the worst, so that the men most likely to succeed are carrying the finest weapons and shields. In a desperate moment, that is simply good practical sense. The priority now is holding the Trojans away from the ships, and Agamemnon commits to doing whatever that takes. The return of the three wounded leaders heartens the rest of the army, and the tide keeps running against the Trojans. And then comes the most important episode of Book 14, the one we opened with. Ajax the Greater wounds Hector by hurling a boulder, another of those stones two men of the present day could not lift. The throw takes Hector square in the chest and stuns him. The book ends with Hector dazed, the wind knocked out of him, his companions pulling him out of the battle to one side. The Greeks, watching Troy's best man carried off, are heartened further still. On the human level, that is the whole account. Hold it there, we will come back to it. In Book 15, Hector gets his strength back and returns. With him leading, the Trojans finally break the wall open, widening the gap where the gate had stood, pouring through it in a swarm, and reaching the ships. The moment the Greeks have dreaded all day has arrived. Hector, clear-headed again, lays his hand on the stern of a ship and calls for fire to burn it. And Ajax the Greater leaps from deck to deck above the fighting, roaring at his comrades to rally and defend the vessels, holding the line very nearly single-handed. Agamemnon, Diomedes, and Odysseus are back in the fight, wounded and short of their full strength. Achilles is in camp doing nothing. It falls to Ajax, almost alone, to keep the Trojans off the ships. Read purely on the human level with no reference to the gods at all. This narrative is coherent, suspenseful, and packed with excitement. It is also remarkably realistic. The give and take of combat, the shifting momentum, leaders ignorant of what is happening elsewhere on the field, uncertain rumors of a breach in the wall, the wounding and withdrawal and the return of warriors, and the alternating encouragement and despair on the two sides. You could strip out every reference to the gods and read books 11 through 15 exactly as described. Before we turn to the divine level, one thing about those book numbers. The book divisions are entirely artificial, a later addition to the poem made by scholars at the Great Library of Alexandria in the 3rd or 2nd century BC. It takes roughly 24 papyrus scrolls of ordinary length to write out the full text of the Iliad, and about the same again for the Odyssey, which is a vivid illustration of how much more efficient the codex, the book as we know it, is than the scroll. In the early centuries of transmission, a scribe copying the poems would simply write to the end of a scroll of usable length and stop, then begin the next scroll in the middle of a sentence. At some point in that period, one of the great scholar librarians at Alexandria, a person whose identity we do not know, had the idea of standardizing the divisions so that every scroll would end at the same fixed point. Beyond regularizing the text, this did something crucial. It made reference easy. Instead of gesturing vaguely at a scene about a third of the way through the poem, you could cite Book 6 and even a line number and point precisely to Hector's conversation with Andromache on the walls of Troy. That is why the divisions are still in use today, but the original performer had nothing of the kind in mind. To say that Hector regains his strength at the beginning of Book 15 is a purely artificial construct. In performance, the battle unfolded as one seamless, continuous narrative, and on the human level alone, it works beautifully. Now add the gods, because Zeus has promised victory to Hector on this longest day. He is working against the Greeks throughout the whole section, and almost none of them ever know it. In Book 11, when Ajax temporarily falls back, it is because Zeus has placed fear in his mind. In Book 12, when Poseidon reaches up, seizes part of the wall and pulls it away, he does it because Zeus has poured extra strength into him at that moment. The speech about glory is entirely sincere. It is also not the only reason the wall comes apart in his hands. In Book 13, the figure moving among the Greeks and rallying them is not Calchas at all. It is the god Poseidon, wearing the prophet's shape, urging the warriors to fight. And here Homer lets a little light through. Some of the Greeks sense it. The two Ajaxes, Ajax the Greater and Ajax the Lesser, remark to one another that this was not Calchas, that it must have been a god who put fresh heart into them for the fight. They feel the presence. They cannot name it. That is as close as mortals in this poem usually get. In Book 14, Hera watches Poseidon rallying the Greeks and decides to help them by getting Zeus to look away. This is the famous seduction scene. Wondering how to draw her husband off the battlefield so that Poseidon can keep working, she seduces him so that he will fall asleep, and Homer describes it in luxurious detail. At the very moment the Greeks are gaining the upper hand. Two levels again, running together. Down at the ships, the Greeks press their advantage. Up on Mount Ida, Zeus and Hera make love, and Zeus falls asleep. And here is the masterstroke of narrative control. It is precisely while Zeus sleeps that Ajax is able to throw the boulder and wound Hector. Zeus had promised Hector power for this one day. Under that promise, Hector might easily have been killed or hurt far more gravely by such a throw. He is struck at all only because the king of the gods is unconscious. Hector's recovery from his daze coincides exactly with Zeus waking at the start of Book 15. Zeus looks down, sees Hector dazed and vomiting blood, and springs immediately into action. He sends Apollo to heal and strengthen Hector. He sends Iris to tell Poseidon to withdraw and stop helping the Greeks. And he rebukes Hera furiously for tricking and seducing him into sleep, threatening her with violence if she interferes again, reminding her that once, long ago, when she had crossed his will, he hung her from the sky in a golden chain, with an anvil at each foot. With Zeus awake, Hector is restored, and the Trojans take back their dominance. Apollo does more than heal. He leads Hector and the Trojans back into the battle, running ahead of them and spreading panic among the Greeks simply by looking at them. When the god stares into a Greek's eyes, that man is overwhelmed with dread and terror. And when the massed Trojans break down the Greek wall around the bridge Hector had opened at the gate, What happens on the divine level is that Apollo kicks the wall down. Homer gives us both moments as similes, and similes are among the most characteristic elements of his style, in which one thing is compared to another. Hector, strengthened, rushes into battle like a well-fed stallion breaking out of his stall and galloping toward the mares. And Apollo kicks the Greek wall apart as easily as a small boy kicks apart a sandcastle he has built on a beach. The double motivation reaches down into the smallest details. When Odysseus was stabbed in the ribs and the spear point failed to reach his vitals, what Homer actually says is that Athena did not permit the point to pass through to his vital organs. In truth, separating this narrative into a purely human strand and a purely divine strand does some violence to Homer's text, because in the telling the two are intricately interwoven. As the story is sung, gods and men act simultaneously in the same breath, in the same line. Only under analysis does it become clear that the humans themselves usually have no idea what is unfolding on the level above them, and this double-level action drives the poem to its turning point. The narrative is now approaching the moment when Achilles' beloved friend Patroclus will go into battle wearing Achilles' armor and fight for the Greeks in Achilles' place. Everything in this section pushes toward that entry, and its inevitability is sealed when Zeus, awake again in Book 15, having sent Apollo and Iris and rebuked his wife, foretells the rest of the story. Patroclus will go into battle. Hector will kill Patroclus. Achilles will return to the fighting, and Hector will die at Achilles' hands. The culmination of this whole double-level narrative is the god's own account of the road the action must take. The longest day in the Iliad is, in the end, a single seamless battle that Homer sings on two planes at once: the desperate, realistic struggle the warriors themselves live through, and the design of the gods that only we are permitted to see. Holding both at the same time is the source of this poem's peculiar power and of its meditation on mortality. And as Zeus lays out the road ahead, every thread of that longest day pulls toward one entry: Patroclus in Achilles' armor, walking toward a death that will bring Achilles back to the war.